Welcome back to Rumblefish Rebuild episode number 2, where we are going to take a look at rebuilding the rear end, the rear suspension linkage of this bike, rebuild the rear shock, and reassemble the drivetrain that we cleaned in episode 1, which you can check out right up here. If you've already seen that, let's jump right in and let's get this bike trailworthy. So right now it's mid-March and we just had our nicest weekend of the spring that we've had so far. It's in the 50s, started off in the 60s. It's a great time to ride. I just got this bike out on the trails for the first time. This is my new gravel bike. We'll be talking about it in the future sometime. I want to get that Rumblefish back out on the trails as quickly as possible. I hope you want to get out on the trails as quickly as possible. So let's get these bikes fixed up and get ready to ride. First things first, we're blasting through this disassembly. This consists of removing the bolts, removing the shock, removing the chainstay and the seat stay, and getting it all aside, ready to clean and rebuild. Most importantly, we are taking pictures or remembering how this came apart so that we can put it back together quickly and the way it came from the factory. Last but not least, use good tools so that we don't strip any bolt heads as we're removing everything. With the chainstay and the seat stay removed, we are going to examine all the bearings that are pressed into these components. Some of the larger bearings actually seem to be moving fairly well. However, the bearings that are in the linkage, which is what connects the back end of the shock to the frame of the bike, you can hear they sound a little gritty. So rather than trying to press these out and replace them like I know Trek would like to see us do and most manuals would probably suggest you do, I'm going to pull these seals off. These are sealed bearings. These seals are pressed in there. I'm gonna pull these off. I'm gonna do it using an X-Acto knife. So many videos out there will say not to use a knife. I've never had success using a pick, which is what so many people recommend doing. These always wind up just jamming it further in. I can never get behind it. So I'm gonna be super careful. With the seals removed, take a look at our ball bearing here. All the grease has been removed using a little bit of pressurized brake cleaning. Blast through here like that. And once that is done, you can feel the condition of the bearing without any grease. This is a very unscientific way of doing this, but it feels a heck of a lot better. Whatever crud was in there is not gunking them up anymore. I'm just gonna clean off all the old grease. And you can see with some of the grease that I just pumped into the bearing, once we push the seal back in here, I'm going to use our pick, and that's just going to allow me to put some pressure on here while I seat it back over the balls between the bearing races. Give it a quick spin, see how it feels. Get some of that grease all worked in there. And we feel much better. So I'm just going to wipe this down with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, and it should be ready to throw back into the bike. We are done with the linkage. Rather than go through that same process over and over again, I'm just gonna do a quick time lapse. We're gonna race through this. You're gonna see all 8 bearings that I still need to service here on the chainstay and the seat stay. Nope, chainstay, seat stay. Is it 8? No, it's only 6. So 6 bearings on the chainstay and 6 bearings on the seat stay and the chainstay. Rebuild the fork and get it all back onto the bike. And then we'll wrap this up. Let's get to it. Hello there. I couldn't help myself. I really do want to do a slow teardown of at least one of these bearings. I think it's really valuable to see what's going on. I will put down at the bottom of the screen, if you don't want to see this, where we put this all back together or where we start working on the shock and get things going. So I like to get the knife, slide it down the outside race here. So you want to slip past the seal and just feel metal the entire time, metal to metal. And you should be able to get past the seal and pop it up. I'm just going to put a nice layer. They work better if you make sound effects. Just get off some of this grease with the rag. Hit it with a little alcohol. Last thing I'm gonna do before we get the rear end of the bike fully rebuilt is I'm gonna rebuild this shock. I am not gonna go into great detail because one, I don't think it is within the wheelhouse of the beginner mechanic, which is really who I'm trying to get involved into mechanics of their bicycle. Two, I'm not an expert myself, so I have to consult guides when I do it. So I don't think I'm necessarily qualified to do an instructional video on it, but if you are servicing a Float RP2 DRCV shock, I will be putting a link in the description below so that you can look at the guide that I'm using to rebuild this. We are going to test this shock overnight with about 75 pounds of pressure. I want to make sure that it holds that for about 24 hours before we put any more time into rebuilding the rear end. But once that checks out, hopefully it does, we'll be all set to rebuild the back end of the bike and move on to the brakes. So, procrastination led to a much more thorough rear shock pressure test, and it checked out. Everything's good. We let this sit for about 5 or 6 days instead of only 1 day, and we're good. So we're gonna get the rear shock back into place, seat stays, chain stay, rear drivetrain all rebuilt. I'm gonna do this in time-lapse mode and just try to interject some important things as we go. As we sit back and enjoy some reassembly, I want to emphasize the importance of both torque specifications and thread locker. They are critical to ensure that your bike stays together as you're careening down the trails at 20 or 30 miles an hour. Okay, we'll convert 150 inch-pounds to Newton meters. Now, if you don't have a torque wrench, you can purchase an inexpensive beam-style torque wrench off Amazon for just over 20 bucks, which I would only recommend for aluminum frame bikes, or you can move into higher quality bike-specific tools from Park, ranging from $40 up to $120-something. As for thread locker, you should absolutely have that for critical parts, and the standard medium-strength blue thread locker from either Permatex or Loctite will do the trick. All right, cool. Shock is in. First, I'm gonna start with the seat stay. This requires you to bring the seat stay right down the seat post. And we'll get the last of these bolts. Not sure if you can make this out. This is an automotive torque wrench. This is a little bit beyond what the average bike torque wrench can do. This bolt that I'm doing here requires 34 Newton meters, where mine only goes up to like 15 or 16. So I went and got this one from the garage. When you see something like this, this also converts to really freaking tight. Here we're just running them through the final bit of assembly. I'm just putting a bit of grease over the bearings to prevent water from getting through the seals. Then we're going to put in the bolts and, of course, get the nuts on and tighten. This is the last bit of assembly before we jump into the drivetrain rebuild. There we go. Look how smooth that is. We're gonna make a quick jump off the bike here, and I'm going to reassemble our cassette. I have a 10-speed cassette, so you wanna make sure you have all your gears. There should be 10 gears. And I'm also gonna point out that on the gears that are separate, which you can see after the first 4 gears, all of the notches and grooves that you will find in the cassette gears are gonna be facing outside of the bike. So you know which way they go because one side is going to be perfectly clean, the other side is going to have some notches and grooves, which are going to help to pick the chain up when you're doing downshifts up the cassette. You're also going to need either a very inexpensive $5 to $10 cassette lock ring tool. This one is from Park Tool. I happen to love this Abbey Bike Tools Crombie, which is a cassette lock ring tool with a welded on steel handle. I'm just gonna put the slightest bit of grease. You need very, very little. So you gotta kind of like spin, figure it's not gonna work. There she is. that. When you're rebuilding your cassette, take your time, make sure all the notches line up, and get all the spacing perfectly even. It'll make your process much smoother. And the last two actually have the spacer built in, so that's super convenient. You don't need a spacer on the last couple. And then take your lock ring, just gonna thread on the inside. I think I'm gonna use both tools here. And then I use the grommet to tighten it all up. You can tighten it up, you can see it's ratcheted, so you don't need any Loctite or thread locker. There is a torque spec on here, but pretty freaking tight is usually good enough. Now it's time to get the crank in and get this rear end ready to finish up. I've already put a sealing ring on the inside that's going to sit up against this bearing. So we're just going to put a little more grease like we did with the other bearings. Oh, I'm going to put some grease on here as well. All of this just really helps water. It helps it assemble well, but it prevents water from getting into places it shouldn't. And it makes assembly so smooth. On the back side, I still have another sealer and the crank arm that's gonna go over here. The rear tire on here now, or the rear wheel, I have no chain on it and no derailleur because we are about to use my, I did this backwards, favorite tool, which is super specific for bikes. So as many of you may know, your derailleur is what shifts both the front and the rear set of cogs, and a derailleur hanger is a very malleable piece of metal that holds the derailleur onto the bike, and it's very malleable so it can deform if it gets hit rather than an expensive derailleur or an even more expensive frame. But they are not cheap themselves either, and they can get tweaked super easily. I'm going to use my derailleur adjustment gauge to get this lined up. Super perfect. I'm not going to go over exactly how this works. Part Tool has a lovely video on how to use this, so I will put a link in the description below on what you need to do to make this work properly. But I'll put this in a time lapse. You can watch me, watch that video, and get yourself one of these because it's an amazing bike tool if you want to save some money on derailleurs over the lifetime of your bike. Again, I will not be going over how to adjust a derailleur and a cable length and all that. I will link another video in the description below on how to do it. That's a whole nother topic that I don't need to cover, but we got this on. We're gonna get this chain on. I'll get everything all tuned up, and then the rear end of this bike will be all done. So if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see the next video, give me a subscribe. I will be doing another video next time on the front brake and rear brake rebuild, as well as the front fork, and then a final wrap up. And this bike will be ready for the trails by the end of March, hopefully.